Welcome, everyone. It's my honor to introduce Professor Andrew Appel. You all know him, of course. He's a professor of computer science. He's been an integral part of CITP since the beginning, and his involvement has profoundly shaped CITP, not just at the beginning, but throughout the years. In fact, I think for several years you carried Freedom to Tinker on your back, all on your own. We're very grateful for all of your involvement, and also for doing this today. Andrew is in Ithaca these days, and his work on topics related to elections has really spanned the gamut from really technical and low-level programming languages, software verification, to policy, and also informing the public. I still remember watching his talk on YouTube, which I think is a well-known talk, has gotten a lot of attention over the years, really demolishing the idea that voting by internet could be a good idea. So Andrew was the chair of the CS department when I joined, and so he was a mentor to me. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples of little things he said or did that had a big impact on me, and I thought that would be more fun than a kind of formal introduction. One of those was Andrew sending me a draft of his NSF proposal to get my comment. I don't know if you recall this, and that was very surprising to me that a very senior and famous professor would ask for feedback from me, a very junior faculty member. And I remember thinking, I was a little jittery about giving feedback. I loved it overall, but in parts where I wanted to give critical feedback, I was thinking about how to word it. But I recall you called me up afterwards, and we had a very nice conversation where you just wanted to learn more about the feedback, and I really wanted to emulate that aspect of being open to feedback, even from very junior people, and receiving that really well. And I also wanted to mention, again, you might not remember this at all, when I was thinking about writing my first book, I came to you for advice. Again, this was pre-tenure. I was wondering if that was a good idea or not, and you shared your own experiences of writing a book pre-tenure. So that was, again, very formative for me. Decided to go ahead, and now I'm on my fourth book. So that was really a shift in how I've structured my career. Those are just two examples, but you've been a tremendous mentor and really a big influence. So thank you again for doing this.
Oh, thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about elections, but first, let me talk about before there was CITP. What I do since about 30 years ago is 90% very technical things in formal verification of software correctness, and maybe 10% on the average tech policy. I got here as an assistant professor in 1986 working on compilers. And Ed Felton got here in 1993 as an assistant professor working on operating systems. And also in 1993, the World Wide Web was invented on top of the internet, which was itself only 10 years old or less. In 1995, Dan Bernstein, who was a PhD student at Berkeley, sued the US Department of State regarding cryptography. At that time, the US government claimed that it could regulate cryptography. To export your cryptographic software was like exporting a fighter jet. It was a munition, and you had to seek a license. So he sued. In 1996, the Java language was invented, and the Hot Java and Netscape browsers that incorporated Java as sort of the browser automation language in a way that JavaScript is now used. And in 1996, my PhD student, Drew Dean, and Ed's student, Dan Wallach, came to me and said, we've been working on this project, not the one that our advisors told us to work on, of finding security vulnerabilities in Java and in web browsers that allow us to sort of take over the browsers and spoof things. And they also went to Ed and told him what was going on. So notice on this slide, it's the PhD students that are making things happen while their advisors just continue in their same ruts. In 1996, Bernstein's lawyer, Cindy Cohn, who's now the executive director of the EFF, wrote to me and asked me to write a declaration about distributing software as an academic pursuit, because I had been distributing open source software since 1987, which we had to do on mag tapes in the mail because there was no internet. And this had to do with that Dan Bernstein wanted to distribute his cryptographic software and demonstrate to the judge that this is a normal thing and not something that only hacker weirdos would do. So I wrote that declaration. Drew Dean and Dan Wallach joined with Ed Felton and published papers on Java security and browser security, and they got into the business of publishing papers about security vulnerabilities in widely used software, which led to legal threats from the companies whose software was demonstrated to be vulnerable. And they found that there was nobody at these companies they could call up to say, we found a security vulnerability in your software, and we would like to tell you about it 3 months before we publish it. So the whole principle of responsible disclosure and the fact that there is someone at those companies that you can call was developed maybe not only by Ed Felton, but by Ed Felton and a few other people in this country to sort of form the ethical basis for doing security research. In 1998, the United States and 18 states sued Microsoft, saying that they were illegally maintaining a monopoly by bundling the browser, Internet Explorer, we all use that now, with the operating system. And Ed's testimony was basically, yes, it really is possible to disentangle, as a technical matter, the browser from the operating system. Universal Studios sued a guy named Ramirez because he was distributing the DCSS program that could remove the copy protection from, I guess it was compact discs, videos. And the lawyer for the defendant, pro bono, must have found me by reading my court declarations in other cases and asked me to testify in that case. So this is about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and digital rights management and the protection of, basically it means that you could not really access the stuff on your own computer. The beginning of the locked down world where people don't own their own stuff. And we had some things to say about that, although mostly we lost. We did write this article, Technological Access Control Interferes with Non-Infringing Scholarship, about copy-paste. In the year 2000, there was the Bush versus Gore election. There were some issues with voting equipment. In the 20th century, nobody cared about the technology of how we vote, except for maybe 2 computer scientists, not including me. But starting in November of 2000, a lot of people cared a lot. As soon as George W. Bush was inaugurated, the United States dropped the Microsoft lawsuit, which was, Microsoft had been found to have illegally maintained its monopoly, but the penalty was appealed, and so there was a rehearing of the penalty phase before a different judge. And that's when the government dropped out, but 9 of the 18 states decided to fight on, and they needed to get their own expert. And Ed was already the expert for the feds, so they asked me to be their expert. And I testified in that phase of the Microsoft antitrust lawsuit saying, well, there's this .NET middleware, and Microsoft should just document what the interface is so that other people can try and compete with that middleware. And Bill Gates got on the stand and explained why that would be impossible. And 10 years later, Microsoft not only documented the interface, they open sourced all of it, which was amazing. So they went far beyond what I proposed they do, and which Bill Gates explained would be impossible. All right, the Help America Vote Act outlawed punch card ballots, which is a good idea because they're a truly terrible voting technology, and in various ways provided money, and that had the effect of encouraging many states to switch to paperless computerized voting machines. And around that time, Professor David Dill of Stanford University, who works in formal verification of computer hardware and so on, noticed that a computer, a von Neumann machine is a computer that you can't tell what software is loaded in it today, and that there would be no reason at all to trust what a computer said about, that it read the input from these buttons, and at the end of the day, this guy got this many votes, and this one got that many votes. I joined his little group of helping to explain to policymakers why paperless computerized voting machines are a terrible idea. And in 2004, Professor Penny Venettis of Rutgers Law School asked me to be an expert witness in her lawsuit against the state of New Jersey about the constitutionality of using paperless voting machines. Between 2004 and 2008, there were many interesting results from Ed Felton and his students, and a few from me and my students about voting machine insecurity. And by 2008, there was research going on here in the policy of cryptography, which has to do with privacy and security, with ownership of your own computer and the freedom to tinker with your own computer, with election technology and voting machines, with many other things. More Ed than me, because as I said, I only do 10% tech policy, and by 2008, Ed was doing maybe 70% tech policy and 30% security. So that led to the founding of CITP. So here we are in CITP, and now let me tell you about how to run trustworthy elections assisted by computers we can't trust. You might think, oh, well, let's get a zero-knowledge cryptographic protocol that enables voters to verify that their votes have been counted without revealing how each voter voted. And that is not the answer. That would never work, and I will explain why. So here's what we understood already by 1890. Well, here's a polling place from 1846 in Missouri, and it's problematical in several ways. This painting was painted by the losing candidate to illustrate, well, there are no paper ballots. There are no ballots at all. You just go up to the election judge and tell them who you're voting for, and these guys back here make tick marks on a piece of paper. So there's no secret ballot, and there were enormous problems with election corruption in the United States in, between 1750 and, 1900 or so, from the lack of the secret ballot. This guy is being paid off with whiskey for his vote, which they can tell that he voted the right way because it had to be out loud. And if these tabulators disagree at the end of the day about how many tick marks there are no ballots to recount. The important question in the 1880s was, how should we design election procedures to be honest and secure and accurate and transparent and trustworthy? You need to allow each person to vote, but only once each. And you need to accurately record the votes and accurately count the votes. And the voter has to be confident that their vote was counted, but maybe they don't trust who's counting the votes. So you need both sides involved in counting the votes. There needs to be a kind of transparency. The election official may be a member of a political party and may have opinions, so you cannot put trust in just one person, because half the people don't necessarily trust that person. And we need the secret ballot for reasons I've explained. And the secret ballot extends to, you can't learn how somebody voted even with her cooperation, because you can always coerce her to cooperate or bribe her or whatever. So it must be that I cannot prove to you how I voted even if I want to. So this led to the following cellulose-based, silicon-based technology. The silicon is in the glass, the windows that illuminate the polling place, and the cellulose is on the paper ballots, the paper poll books, the railings that keep shoulder surfers away from the voting booths, so that you can see that nobody is able to show their vote to anyone. And there's a high-tech ballot box with a register that makes a sound when you put a ballot in and counts how many ballots are in there. And when you sign in, there are members from both political parties checking you in. and members of both political parties watching the ballot box, and so on. So the principle of distributed trust is fully there by 1890. Okay, so even though the parties don't necessarily trust each other, this is in principle going to give you a trustworthy result. So here's what computer scientists understood by 2002. If you put a computer there instead of the other ballot box, and it's just a touch screen with no paper, except maybe the cash register tape that at the end of the day prints out the results, then whoever programs that computer gets to decide whether it accurately counts the votes or just tells you that so-and-so won. And it's easy to program computers because we are computer scientists, right? We understood by 2002 that writing a program that miscounts the votes is just as easy as writing one that counts the votes, or almost as easy. All computerized voting machines can be hacked to make them cheat. The direct recording electronic, which is the technical term for those paperless electronic machines, or ballot marking devices in which you input using various assistive technologies and print out a ballot that can then be counted. Or optical scan ballot counters, they're just computers as well. So you commit election fraud by writing a computer program that doesn't cheat when it's being tested, right? People sometimes test voting machines when it's not during the election, and computers know what day it is. They have clocks in them. And during election day, shifts 10% of the votes from one candidate to another. And once you can install that program in the voting machine, then it can cheat in every election after that for 20 years. Okay, and then you load your program into the voting machines by exploiting a security vulnerability, like opening up the box, replacing a chip, or other means. And software and hardware has vulnerabilities, right? The voting machines of the early 2000s didn't have all of these layers, but modern voting machines are just modern Linux boxes or Windows boxes, and they have all of these same layers that computers have. And if you can corrupt any one of these layers, then you can control the behavior of all the layers above it, and all of these layers from time to time have vulnerabilities. So we cannot really know that the authorized software is running in the authorized way on a computer or a voting machine. That's just basic computer science. So with physical access, this card is from a 2002 era voting machine, and it's how you communicate to the voting machine which candidates are on the ballot in this election, the ballot definition card. But it's also the means by which you install firmware upgrades. Like if there's a file on there called new firmware.bat, it will run it and install it. So if you can hack the computer that is programming the ballot definition card, you can piggyback viruses on there, and you can even make viruses propagate from one voting machine to another, from the voting machines to the computers, or from the internet if these computers are connected to the internet from time to time. Voting machines are hackable, period. What's the solution? Well, here's a solution. The voter fills in the ovals on an optical scan ballot, and this ballot is fed into an optical scanner which counts the votes. Or the optical scanner could be in the precinct right at the polling place, or you could put the ballots into a regular low-tech ballot box and carry them with careful chain of custody, maybe two people from different parties in the car, to the central location where there's an optical scanner at more high speed. And of course, those are computers. They are hackable, but the paper ballot marked by the voter drops into this sealed ballot box, and those can be recountable by hand, by humans looking at the ballot. So there's no computer telling you what it says. You can see it for yourself. And some human marked the ballot with a pen, so no computer was involved in that process. And you could even do random statistical audits that will tell you whether a recount would be a good idea. So that's the principle of the voter-verified paper ballot. The voter sees what's on the paper, and it's the same piece of paper that can be recounted without a computer intermediary. why do we even need the computer at all? Why can't we count the ballots by hand like they do in other countries? Canada, France, Britain, whatever. Well, we have a federal system. In New Jersey, there's like 12 things on the ballot. There's president and senator and congressman and governor and state senator and state legislator and dog catcher. But in California, there's 300 things on the ballot with all their stupid ballot questions and judgeship retentions. And we cannot recount, it's impractical to accurately count those by hand in the short time frame between the election and the time when the public demands results. It may be practical to do statistical by hand audits, and it is practical to do recounts when called for, with the understanding they will take a few days, but we really do need computers to help count the votes. We just should arrange it so we don't have to fully trust those computers. So here is what we thought the solution was, that when you use a touchscreen computer like this to count your votes, it should print a record, a paper trail, that you can see the voter verified paper audit trail. And that can be used in the audits and the recounts by people looking at the same thing that you saw without the computers interpreting it to them. So in 2006, when computer scientists like David Dill and the rest of us were just beginning to explain to policymakers at the counties, at the state, in the US Congress, that these paperless touchscreen voting machines, DREs, direct recording electronic voting machines, are a terrible idea. Here are the places that voted by DREs, all the ones marked in red, various shades of red, using DRE voting machines. And so these are places where the voting machines could be hacked and you would never be able to tell. And the counties marked in green were mostly using hand-marked paper ballots with optical scan. The optical scanners could be hacked, but you could do recounts or audits of the paper ballots. Now, the way it's supposed to work is you explain this to the policymakers and they get it and they change how they do things. So here's how it worked. These are the counties using DRE voting machines in 2024. It worked. We explained it, they understood it, and they mostly switched away from using paperless DRE voting machines. This is actually surprising, because it doesn't always work that way, does it? All right, so that's good news. Hooray? Hooray? I don't know. The theory is that the voter verified paper trail plus random audits together assure trustworthy elections, and there are just two problems left. One is the voter verified paper trail, and the other is audits. So let me talk first about audits. The state of the art in audits of elections in 2000, first of all, you need audits of how many people signed in at the polling place versus how many ballots you found in the ballot box, right? You can keep track of those numbers without compromising the secret ballot, and that's a very basic kind of election accounting that has been pretty well understood for 150 years, and in some states they actually do it well. And the rest of the audits are sort of meaningless unless you've got that part right. But now, if you want to check whether the voting machines are cheating, let's say your optical scan voting machines, you pick 3% of the ballot boxes in your whole election at random. And for each ballot box, you recount by hand and you see if the count comes out the same as what the voting machine claimed for that ballot box. And if they match, then everything's okay. So problem one is 3% enough? And problem two is, what if they don't match? Well, 3% isn't enough, right? 3% does not give you any really meaningful guarantee of the kind that you would be happy with. So the theory of statistical election audits was developed in a much more robust way starting approximately 2009. And the term RLA, risk limiting audit, is a technical term for any method that would guarantee that if the reported electoral outcome is wrong, that is, if the machines make a claim that's different from what you would get by counting what the voters actually did by hand, then there's a certain known predetermined minimum chance that the procedure will correct the reported outcome. And if the reported outcome is correct, there is a 0% chance that the procedure will claim it's incorrect. So if, and the typical methods are examinations by humans of a randomly chosen sample of the paper ballots, right, to get this statistical assurance. And the theory of risk limiting audits, and actually the practice, was largely developed by Professor Philip Stark of University of California, Berkeley, and many other computer scientists in various countries, and election officials and ex-election officials who sort of develop how this should work. And here are some examples of our LA methods. The ballot polling audit. Don't take a random sample of the ballot boxes. You know, if you have 100 ballot boxes in your election, that's just 3 ballot boxes, and you can get some statistical guarantee from that, but it's not a very good one, actually. Suppose you could have an exit poll in which 5% of the voters were forced to honestly tell you how they voted. You could learn a lot from that. So how about this? Randomly select 5% of the ballots from all those ballot boxes and see how they add up. And if the election outcome was claimed by the machines to be, 55% for Smith and 45% for Jones, and you do the ballot polling audit and it says 53% for Smith and 47% for Jones, then you can do the math. The math is not always super easy, and calculate whether the ballot polling audit supports that, that the claimed outcome is correct. We talk about outcome, not the margin of victory, right? The risk limiting audit does not guarantee that the margin of victory as claimed was exactly right. It just says which candidate won. So this is much more efficient and gives you much more statistical guarantee than counting ballot boxes. Even better is the ballot comparison audit. The voting machines produce an electronic file that lists in random order, so we don't compromise the secret ballot, every ballot, 1 line per ballot, and it says on that line what all the votes were on that ballot. And it includes the ballot serial number of that ballot. And there's a physical piece of paper that the voter marked that has that serial number on it. So the computer has now been pinned down to specific claims about what's on specific ballots. If you pull a random sample of those ballots, you can see whether what they have matches. And then you can just add up all the ballots in the electronic file. And this turns out to be extremely efficient. It was invented in this, not in this building wasn't built yet, but at CITP by Calandrino, Halderman, and Felton, and published in the 2007 Electronic Voting Technology Workshop. And here is the ballot comparison audit going on in Orange County, California in 2018. There were 650,000 ballots cast in that county because of California's absurdly long ballot. Some of the ballots were like 3 sheets of paper, so there's 1.4 million ballot pages. And to do a ballot comparison audit to assure that a certain outcome was correct, they only needed to examine 150 of those sheets, 160. But they needed all the sheets accessible. So here's all the sheets laid out in their warehouse on a table. And it was fairly cheap to do. It occupied their staff for this many days, 4 days or something, and cost $4,000 of staff time. So the good news is almost all states have paper ballots now. And many states have audit requirements. The bad news is very few states have strong enough statistical audits to guarantee usefully that the computers weren't cheating. And remember problem 2. What if the audit finds that the outcome is questionable? Well, most state laws don't say what to do there. And most state laws don't require the audit to be done before elections are certified, right? The assumption between all these audits is they will show that everything is okay. And there is no part of most laws that even imagine that it might not be okay. And this is a problem. Okay, let me take a digression and talk about ballot design. This is a human interface problem. Here is a ballot in Palm Beach, Florida in the year 2000. It's the famous butterfly ballot. Underneath here, there's a punch card. As you flip the pages from one contest to another, this cleverly moves across so that you're punching in a different column of the punch card. And you use a hand punch to punch, the first thing for the Republican candidate and the second thing for the Democratic candidate and so on. But actually, no. The Democratic candidate is listed second here, but it's the third hole. The second hole belongs over here to Pat Buchanan. More people punch the second hole than the margin of victory for the Electoral College in Florida. And Florida was the swing state that decided the entire election. So it's entirely plausible, it's the most likely hypothesis that voter confusion about this user interface decided which person got elected for president. Okay, Sarasota, Florida in 2006. This is a computerized touchscreen voting machine, the bad kind that if you misprogram the computer, you could make it cheat, but it wasn't cheating necessarily. It has a small screen, so you can fit one contest on each screen. So there was, here's the United States Senator contest with these candidates. And here's the governor contest. Oh, but on this screen it's the only screen in which they managed to fit 2 different contests. Hiding up here is the other contest for a congressperson. More people omitted to vote in this contest than the margin of victory in that election. Okay, before we get to the next one, I'll just point out this ballot design manual written and published in 2007 by the U.S. Electoral Assistance Commission, which explains how to lay out your optical scan paper ballots so voters won't be so confused. And here is the ballot in Broward County, Florida in 2018. Here are the instructions in English. Here are the instructions in Spanish. Here are the instructions in Haitian Creole. Here's the thing you vote on, which is governor and lieutenant governor, attorney general, chief financial officer. And hiding down here, where if you didn't think you needed the instructions in Haitian Creole, you would stop reading this column and get on with the voting, is the Senate race. And more people omitted to vote in this Senate race than the margin of victory in that Senate race. And you can look at the demographics and conclude that it's highly likely that those people would have voted for the other candidate. And so the outcome of the Senate race was most likely decided by a bad ballot design. So you can see my article. Florida is the Florida of ballot design. But really the point is election protocols must be designed so that humans can execute them reliably. Well, at least until next year when it will be the AIs that get to vote. Although I don't think the AIs will be any better at it than we are, if you look at how AIs work. Okay, so let's talk about the voter verified paper trail. Remember, we didn't trust the touchscreen, the DREs, the paperless touchscreen machines, that if you program them wrong, they could cheat and there would be nothing to recount. There is no paper ballot to recount. We need this paper trail so that we can recount the paper trail. So here's a hand-marked optical scan ballot. That's a kind of voter verified paper trail. The voter got to see where the mark is. The people recounting it can see that same mark. I showed you the voter verified paper audit trail, which here's a more modern one, the Express Vote XL, in use in New Jersey, in many counties in New Jersey and in a few other states. And its paper trail is not so useful. When you have hand-marked optical scan paper ballots, you would like to have a usability accommodation for people with disabilities who cannot mark a paper ballot by hand, either a vision disability, with blind people, or a motor disability, maybe you can't hold a pen. And in fact, the Help America Vote Act of 2002 requires that every polling place have some sort of accessible voting technology. And so here is the kind of accessible, well, the touchscreen paperless machine with an audio interface was one kind, but here's another kind that works with optical scan paper ballots. It's called a ballot marking device. And you use the touchscreen, or if you can't see, you can use these big buttons here with the headphones to go through the ballot. And then it prints out an optical scan bubble ballot with the bubbles filled in that can be scanned by an optical scanner. But about 10 years ago, a few states started saying, let's use these ballot marking devices for all voters. So here's the express voting machine. There's the touch screen here. The voter, after signing in at the registration desk, gets a ballot card, maybe this big, and it's blank except for the barcode that indicates which precinct they belong to. And they bring it over, insert it in the machine, use the touch screen, and then this ballot card gets printed out. This express vote does not count the votes. It's not a tabulator. It only produces a paper ballot card. And the choices of candidates you voted for are all printed there in plain text where you can read it. And they're also encoded in barcodes so that the optical scanner can read it. And the problem with using ballot marking devices for all voters is that BMDs can be hacked just as easily as other voting machines, of course. They're just computers. And if the BMD cheats and changes votes, most voters won't notice. And any audit or recount will count what's on the paper, which is those fraudulent votes. And the research about human behavior on these machines didn't really start to exist until these machines were deployed for all voters. So the first paper, I think a very important paper, in 2018, these researchers from Georgia Tech went over the state line into Tennessee and went to a polling place, a vote center, and stood in the corner where observers are allowed to stand and watched as the voters took the ballot cards from the express votes and carried them over to the optical scanner, and they measured that, well, 53% of the voters didn't even look at the card. Like, do you look at the receipts from your ATM when you get cash? An obsolete question. Nobody ever gets cash anymore, but okay. And those that did look at the ballot card, half the voters looked at the ballot card, and they looked at it for like 4 seconds. There were 18 contests on that ballot, so that's a quarter of a second per contest. There's no way that if one of those had been changed fraudulently by the computer, they would have a reliable way of noting. At the University of Michigan, Alex Holderman and his students did the following experiment. They set up a real voting machine in a non-real election in a public library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And they asked voters to try out the voting machine, and they had on the ballot the same thing that was in the real election from last week. And the voters made their choices. And these are choices the voters would understand and have thought about because they actually voted last week for those same candidates. And it printed out a ballot card, and of course, it hacked it to cheat and alter the vote in one contest. And 93% of voters didn't notice, or either didn't notice or noticed but didn't say anything about it, which from correcting your bad vote is just as important. So those were interesting. here's the scientific analysis of the protocol then, based on all that information. And this we sort of developed in 2018, 2019, published in the Election Law Journal in 2020. Suppose the ballot marking device is cheating by shifting 5% of the votes from candidate A to candidate B. If you can move 5% of the votes in an election, that's significant, because a 5% win is basically a kind of landslide. And if 7% of the voters whose vote has been changed will notice it and report it to a poll worker, well, when you report it to the poll worker, what's the poll worker supposed to do? The poll worker is supposed to say, "That's all right, sir, we'll void that one and you can do it over." So suppose you do it over and it doesn't cheat this time, then you have prevented your vote from being stolen. But that just means that the other 93% of the people, which is 93% of the 5% whose votes were actually stolen, so 4.7% or whatever of the voters will have their vote shifted from candidate A to candidate B and won't notice it. So the machine can get away with stealing almost the proportion of the votes that it set out to.
Unless somebody talks to a reporter.
But you might think, this voter has just caught the machine cheating red-handed. But they can't prove it, right? So in this polling place where there's, let's say 600 voters, that, you can do the math, 1 out of every 200 will have noticed the machine cheating. So 3 voters all day go to the poll worker and say, "It didn't come out the way I voted on the touchscreen." Poll worker does not know whether the voter is wrong or the machine is wrong, has no way of determining that, doesn't need to. They say, "That's all right, sir, we'll void your ballot and you can do a new one." If by talking to a reporter, you could get the whole election annulled and redone, the Secretary of State of Michigan can't void the results of an election because 3 voters in every polling place claimed that the machine was cheating. Because if they could, then you would find 3 voters in every polling place. You'd find 10 voters in every polling place, right? So the what if it comes out wrong, which I explained was a problem before with audits, is a much bigger problem with ballot marking devices. There is no remedy. Yes?
I'm a little hung up on the barcodes.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Who's barcodes? Who's checking if the barcodes match the text? Voters can't really.
Voters can't.
Yeah.
No. So this is like really bad.
Okay.
But if the recount is recounting the text and not the barcodes, then maybe it's not quite as bad as a pure paperless thing. So the barcodes or the QR codes that they now use in Georgia are a really significant problem. But almost as significant is the problem of using the ballot marking device at all for the reasons I've explained. Okay, so ballot marking devices are not adequately audible. They can be hacked as easily as any other voting machine. If they mark the wrong votes on a certain percentage of the ballots, most voters won't notice. Any recount will count the fraudulent votes, the votes marked on the paper, not what the voter did on the touchscreen that we can no longer see. And if the voter claims that the paper is different from what they marked on the screen, there's no way to assess that claim. There is nothing that can be done, even if the voter catches the ballot marking device cheating. And these all-in-one machines, which are called ballot marking devices, but have their ballot behind glass where you can't touch it, and after you get to look at it, it deposits it into a ballot box where it can be recounted. And the ballot in here has that same format with the barcodes and the human-readable text, but it's dimly lit because there's a curtain around it, and you can't hold it in your hands and look at it up close. And I demonstrated that the paper path of that machine is designed such that after the last time you looked at it, it still runs past a print head that could print more stuff on it because of just the way they designed the paper path. So these machines are really terrible.
Well, it's not all all-in-one machines. That one seems designed to cheat. I mean, that particular model, I mean, that's what's-
Another company, so that model is made by one major voting machine company. Another major voting machine company also makes a model of a ballot marking device where it happens that the paper runs past a print head after the last time the voter sees it.
happens.
Well, I think the engineers at these companies fall into the same trap of not thinking of what if I'm hacked. They know they're not cheating. This is the most generous view, but it's good enough, this view. If you know you're not cheating, it's hard for you to imagine that somebody has hacked your machine, right? The hardest thing to learn in being able to do computer security is to think outside the box like the attacker, right? And once you learn how to do that, a lot of things become obvious. But before then, you fall into these potholes and make these elementary mistakes. Okay, so this thing is the voter verified paper audit trail that we computer scientists, including me, were advocating from 2003 to 2007. So our mistake, we were wrong, but what have we learned? Election protocols must be designed so that humans can execute them reliably. That's part of what we learned. The other part should have been obvious even back in 2003, but I just didn't think through. What if it doesn't match? What do you do then? And that question was staring us in the face for 17 years before anybody thought of asking it. When a machine marks, then a human checks, we need a dispute resolution protocol, right? To figure out what then. And the problem with ballot marking devices is that there's no workable dispute resolution protocol. And that dooms the whole enterprise. Now, let's talk about internet voting. How about this? A zero-knowledge cryptographic protocol that lets voters verify their votes have been counted without revealing how each voter voted. Well, there are such protocols. One such kind is called end-to-end verified internet voting. Competent and respectable cryptographers have worked on these protocols. What do I want to say about them? The fatal flaws are that the humans won't execute their part of the protocol. There is no adequate dispute resolution mechanism, and if the voter's computer is hacked, all bets are off. So let me talk about what the protocols are and why these are true about them. The typical E2E VIV protocol works like this. I use my computer or some voting kiosk, let's say, to prepare my ballot, and the ballot gets encrypted, and I'm not sure the right votes have been encrypted. I want it to be decrypted, and I want it to be transmitted. And so I want you to decrypt my ballot so I can see what's on it, and I also want you to transmit it to be counted. Now, if I can do both of those, if I can get a kind of receipt that shows me what was on my ballot and you count my ballot, then I can be coerced or bribed or paid to show somebody how I voted and get my cup of whiskey or my $50. $50 was the going rate for a blank absentee ballot in Gary, Indiana, 15 years ago. So here's the protocol. The human flips a coin. And if it comes up heads, they ask for the ballot to be decrypted and shown to them. If it comes up tails, they ask for it to be transmitted and counted. And so I can probabilistically guarantee that the ballot is counted as I asked. Are humans going to do this? Real voters? Real voters won't even look at their ballot card for 4 seconds. Okay, they're not going to execute this protocol. It's a confusing kind of thing to have to either learn that your ballot was marked the right way or that it was counted, but you can't have both, and you better flip a coin, otherwise your behavior is predicted. This is impossible for real humans. And, even worse, what the cryptographers are trying to figure out is what's the dispute resolution protocol if the human finds that it was improperly encrypted. right? There's no dispute resolution mechanism. And finally, if you're voting by internet from your own computer or your phone, and you try and execute this protocol, what technology is it that's going to decrypt your ballot and show you what's on it? Why, it's your computer or your phone. And if your computer or your phone is hacked, then the user interface can show you that all is well and the votes are just as you ask, but it will transmit something different. So the insecurity of the end terminals, the voters' computers, is really the biggest fatal flaw with any kind of internet voting, including with these zero-knowledge styles. Okay, so we'll wrap up, right? The principles are, it's not just the tech, it's the protocol. Protocol must include dispute resolution, so that's the fatal flaw of these internet voting systems. It's the fatal flaw of ballot marking devices, which are now used in many states. The protocol must fit the abilities of human voters, which is the fatal flaw of zero-knowledge systems, not necessarily the fatal flaw of all internet voting systems, and it's certainly the fatal flaw of ballot marking devices. If human voters are not able to bother looking at their ballot cards, then the ballot card doesn't work. Whereas with hand-marked optical scan ballots, we presume that the human voter knows where they marked the ballot, or pays enough attention to where their pen is, because that's what they're doing. And then, any part of the protocol that in which computers interpret votes, either the votes from the voters, or reading the votes back to the voters, or to the people counting the votes, any part of the protocol in which computers interpret votes can be hacked. So the protocol must be reliable even if the computers are hacked. And that's, again, the fatal flaw of ballot marking devices and paperless direct recording electronic machines. And it's the fatal flaw of internet voting. So in conclusion, the least bad technology we have, the least unreliable, the most reliable technology we have is the hand-marked optical scan paper ballot counted by optical scan voting machine and recountable by hand and subjectable to risk-limiting audits by human inspection of randomly chosen samples of the paper ballots. Questions? Yes.
Did you tell your opinion to those cryptographer experts about their E2E voting
Yes.
protocol to help them to figure out a new zero-knowledge end-to-end internet voting
Right.
protocol?
So people like Josh Benelo, who is a cryptographer at Microsoft Research and who is the developer of some of these end-to-end verifiable voting protocols, not just end-to-end verifiable internet voting, but also some paper ballot-based systems that include this coin flipping principle. He believes that some of these end-to-end protocols are worth using, but he also agrees that end-to-end verified internet voting is not secure enough for use. That there's no version of known right now of end-to-end verified internet voting that is appropriate to use in public elections. So I think that's more or less the consensus of even the experts in cryptographic voting systems. Yes?
So most of the stuff you talked about ended around 2020. Since 2020, there's a new risk, I would say, which is people not believing ballot results, regardless of whether they're trustworthy. Has there been work in that area as well?
Let me go back to the map, if I can find it. Here's the map in 2024. The green is hand-marked paper ballots with optical scanners. The yellow is ballot marking devices with optical scanners. And the red is paperless touchscreens. And there were a few states in which after the, and the map was very similar in 2020 to what I show in 2024. And after the 2020 election, there were a few states that were close and in which people believed that the election was stolen by the computers. And in several of those states, including like Georgia and Nevada, I think, and, you know, or Arizona, there were paper ballots that could be recounted. Some of those states had paper ballots that were by ballot marking devices, which are certainly not as good as the hand-marked paper ballots. And in some of those states, the ballots were actually recounted. And that helped convince many people, not everyone, that the 2020 presidential election was decided by what the voters actually voted in those states. Now, if those states had had paperless direct recording electronic touchscreens which could not be recounted, we would not have that answer for them. So that's part of the answer to your question. There is a lot of citizen activism in lots of states to push for paper ballots marked by hand in states that currently have ballot marking devices, like, I don't know, Arkansas, Texas, Georgia.
New Jersey, isn't it?
New Jersey, yeah. And
Though
a lot
not
of that
not if you vote by
citizen
mail.
activism comes from people who thought that the 2020 election was hacked in some way. So after the 2000 election, the people interested in voting technology, a lot of them were people that thought that that election was screwed up by the technology, and now it's people that thought the 2020 election was screwed up by the technology. And there are bills in the Congress now having to do with paper ballots. Problem with election legislation, whether it's by Democrats or Republicans, is that they take some of the technological reforms, which might be a good idea, and mix it with a bunch of highly partisan political reforms, such as, well, I won't go into the details, that make it too partisan to pass. And I think there are technological measures embedded with bills that came from the Democrats 5 years ago and coming from the Republicans now that both parties could probably agree on and would improve things, but they have always gotten mixed up with highly partisan things, and nothing has ever passed the US Congress. This progress that I show you was made in the states and in the counties. Yes?
You mentioned many states have audit requirements, but in most cases they're not strong enough. So how are they worded?
Oh, well, if you just recount 3% of the ballot boxes, and you don't do it in a timely way, the law doesn't say you have to do it before results are certified, and the law doesn't say what happens if the counts come out different, then it's pretty useless. So the way to get to risk limiting audits, right, the kind that technically could actually be useful, I mentioned some algorithms for risk limiting audits, but they're moderately technical, and they need to be adapted to each state's own laws about how elections work at all. And so the recommendation has been that a state can adopt pilot audits where in those counties where the early adopter election officials want to try risk limiting audits, they can try it, and they can be assisted by nonprofit organizations or even for-profit organizations that can provide consulting services to explain how it's done. And once the pilot audits work, you find that the county election officials are very happy to be able to have another way to prove to their constituents that their election wasn't cheating. And they tell their friends in the next county, and you can begin to adopt it statewide. And that's how Colorado got to its position as being one of the very few states with meaningful risk limiting audits. And Rhode Island, and Virginia's getting there, and Pennsylvania has taken the first few steps. Yes.
Any political progress on what you said was a big problem, what to do if a risk limiting audit fails?
If the risk limiting audit says, I cannot guarantee that the outcome is what you would get by recounting the paper ballots by hand, then the clear solution is to recount the paper ballots by hand. And lots of states have laws that provide for recounts of the paper ballots under certain circumstances. And this would be a very well-motivated circumstance. And once you start the process of doing it by hand, where any citizen can see that there's, 3 people at the table, not all from the same political party, observing the ballots and observing the tally, and that the process makes sense to humans, that tends to work.
Okay, but to get there, you need a legislation that the audit has to finish before they're certified, and then that is an excuse for a full manual recount.
That's right.
And is there political progress on that?
In some states, not very many.
Mm.
But yes, there's progress. That is, there's more states this year than 2 years ago, and more states 2 years ago than 6 years ago. But I can still count those states, on one hand. Yes.
So what do we know about the actual propensity for the code either to be corrupted or the ballot machine to be corrupted? Because it seems like those could be audited too.
No, it's really difficult to go up to a computer and tell reliably what software is installed in it. And it's not good enough just to ask whether the right voting application software is in it, because if the operating system is corrupted, then you can have the right software here, but it will run the wrong way. And so knowing what software is in your computer all the way down is basically impossible. The advice that used to be given to certain kinds of people who were visiting China is throw your laptop away when you come home, because it will have been compromised in a way that you can never get to the bottom of. I don't think you can solve this by focusing on the computer security of the voting machine. It's a really good idea to employ good security practices in the design of those machines and the handling of those machines to minimize the attack surface and minimize the exposure, but you can't ever know really what software it's running.
All right, let's thank Andrew again. This was very illuminating. Thank you.